Looks like the snow finally stopped. About time. I need this water for the wash.
Maybe spring is finally here. Got her working.
That's wonderful news. We needed fresh water.
The mule died first. That was how Dr. Elias Voss knew the sickness was real. Not the minor superstition he had dismissed 3 days prior. Not the whiskey-soaked rambling of a man who had spent too many winters alone in the San Juan Mountains. The mule died first, and then the children started burning. Voss had ridden into Silver Creek on a Tuesday in late October of 1885 with $40 in his coat pocket, a scuffed leather satchel packed with morphine sulfate tablets, carbolic acid solution, and a bone-handled surgical kit that had survived both Chancellorsville and a river crossing on the Cimarron. He was 54 years old. His hands were steady. He had no reason to stay. The town sat in a narrow crease between two ridge lines in the San Juan high country, 9,400 feet above sea level, 7 miles off the nearest freight road, reachable by a single rutted track that turned to boot-sucking mud every time clouds stacked up against the peaks. 217 souls had called it home at the height of the silver rush. By the time Voss arrived, that number had thinned to around 180. The mine was slowing. The railroad spur everyone had been promised never materialized. Men left in ones and twos, the way blood drains from a wound, slowly, then all at once. He had come west for his lungs. 17 years of St. Louis winters had left him with a wet cough that no amount of quinine or steam vapor could touch. The dry air of the Rockies was the prescription his own colleagues had given him, half in jest. He did not find it funny. He packed a trunk, sold his practice on Olive Street, and rode the Denver and Rio Grande as far west as the tracks went. Silver Creek was not a destination. It was a place where the road ended. The first patient was a miner named Gruber. He came to Voss on a Friday evening, bent at the middle, his face the color of old tallow. He complained of cramps low in the abdomen. His stool, he admitted after some embarrassment, had come out bloody that morning. Voss pressed on the man's belly, felt the tightness there, and told him to drink boiled water and rest. He did not panic. Men in mining camps ate badly and drank worse. Gut trouble was as common as gravel. By Sunday, there were 4 more. By Wednesday, there were 11, and 2 of them were children. Voss kept a journal, not a diary, nothing sentimental. A working document. He wrote in cramped, precise, German-trained script, recording names, and ages, water sources, food consumed in the previous 2 weeks, proximity to other cases, date of first symptom, progression by day. He drew lesion patterns in the margins. He noted that the abdominal cramping came first, then the fever spiked hard on day 2 or 3. Then came the delirium. The ones who went delirious rarely came back. He had seen this shape before, not in textbooks, but in the field hospitals outside Spotsylvania, where bad water and crowded latrines had killed more men than Confederate rifle fire. He did not say this to anyone. Not yet. The town responded the way frontier towns responded to fear, with noise and action that solved nothing. The preacher, a hollow-cheeked man named Aldrich, organized a burning of the dead man Gruber's mattress and personal effects in the street. The smoke rose black and greasy over the rooftops. 3 men nailed sulfur candles inside the affected cabins and sealed the windows shut to trap the fumigating smoke inside, operating on the logic that bad air had caused the sickness, and more smoke would drive it out. Women boiled dried sage and hung bundles above door frames. Nobody touched the well. Voss watched all of this from the doorway of the small clapboard building he used as a surgery. He watched and he wrote in his journal, and he did not sleep more than 2 hours at a stretch. The snow came on Thursday, not a dusting, a real snow, the kind that settled into the passes and did not leave until April. Voss stepped outside at first light and looked at the freight road and understood what it meant. The road was gone. Not impassable in the way muddy roads are impassable. Gone. At 3 feet of hard-packed snow covered the track from the edge of town to the tree line, and beyond the tree line, the drifts would be chest-deep in the cuts between the ridges. No wagon was getting out. No rider either, not without a death wish. He went back inside and looked at his list. 23 names, 6 dead, 17 sick at varying stages, and the ones not yet showing symptoms. He counted them in his head, the people he had seen drawing water from the town well that week, filling buckets, washing hands, cooking with it, and the number was too large to write down without his chest tightening. That afternoon, a delegation came to his surgery. 4 men, the ones who still had their health, the ones who had made up their minds. Their spokesman was a large Cornish miner named Trevithick, who had the particular calm of a man who had already decided what he was going to do and was only here out of courtesy. They were leaving, Trevithick said. Not by the freight road, that was closed. But there was a fire trail that cut south through the timber toward Silverton. Hard going, maybe 2 days on foot. They had women and children who were not yet sick, and they intended to keep them that way. Voss did not argue. He asked Trevithick one question. "How many people are you leaving behind?" Trevithick looked at his boots. 12, he said. Too sick to walk. Voss nodded. He picked up his satchel, checked the carbolic supply, and went back to work. By nightfall, he and the 12 were alone in Silver Creek. At the fire trail south was a line of boot tracks disappearing into the dark timber. The snow closed over them within the hour. The temperature dropped to 8 degrees. Somewhere on the far side of the ridge, a timber wolf called once and went silent. Voss sat at his desk, opened his journal to a fresh page, and drew a map of the town from memory. Every structure, every well, every outhouse. He marked each sick household with a cross. He connected the crosses with a line. The line curved toward the well, like a compass needle finding north. He stared at it for a long time. Then he pulled on his coat, lit a lantern, and went outside into the dark and the cold to start pulling water. Voss pulled the bucket up hand over hand, the windlass rope stiff with cold. Ice crystals packed into the braid, where it had frozen and thawed and frozen again over the course of the week. The well was stone-lined, deep, dug 3 years prior by the men who platted Silver Creek, when the silver was still coming out in fist-sized chunks, and the future looked like something worth building toward. It had never run dry. The water had always looked clean, tasted clean, cold and faintly mineral, the way good mountain water tastes, and everyone in town had trusted it the way they trusted the ground underfoot. Voss set the bucket down in the snow beside the well, coping, and went back to his surgery. He returned with a square of white muslin cut from a shirt he kept for surgical dressings. Clean, tight woven, unbleached. He stretched it across the mouth of a second bucket, tied it at the rim with cotton thread, and poured the well water slowly through it. He held the lantern close and looked at what remained on the cloth. It was not clear. The muslin had gone green-brown at the center, the stain spreading outward in an irregular ring the size of a man's palm. Not mud, not sediment. Something organic, something that had been living in the water and was now caught in the weave of the cloth, visible under lantern light, as plainly as blood on linen. He crouched there in the snow for a full minute without moving. In St. Louis, he had read every paper coming out of London on the work of John Snow, the physician who had mapped a cholera outbreak in Soho 30 years prior, pulled the handle off a contaminated pump, and stopped an epidemic with nothing more than a street map and the willingness to follow the evidence where it led, rather than where he wanted it to go. Snow had been dismissed by half the medical establishment of his era. The miasma men, the bad air theorists, had called his methods primitive, his conclusions presumptuous. Voss had read their rebuttals and thought them fools. He thought so again now, crouching beside a well in 9 inches of snow at 9,000 feet, holding a piece of stained muslin in a hand that had begun, very faintly, to tremble. Not from cold. He stood up. He looked uphill. The town of Silver Creek had been laid out with a miner's pragmatism and no engineering sense whatsoever. The main structures, the assay office, the mercantile, the 3 saloons, of the boarding house ran along the flat at the bottom of the gulch. The residential cabins climbed the slope above, staggered up the hillside in rough rows, connected by footpaths worn into the dirt over 3 years of daily use. The well sat at the base of the slope, central, convenient. Uphill from it, 40 feet, then 80, then 120, were the outhouses. 1 per cabin, some shared between 2. Plank-walled, pit-dug, the pits lined with whatever stone was available. Voss knew what limestone did when it cracked. He climbed. The snow was shin-deep off the packed paths, and he went through it slowly, lantern swinging, scanning the ground. He passed the first outhouse, then the second. At the third, the newest one, raw pine boards still pale, not yet weathered gray, he stopped. He circled it, but he got down on one knee in the snow and held the lantern low, close to the ground, and looked at the earth around the base of the pit. The September rains had been heavy. He knew this from the patients who had mentioned it in passing, the way people mention weather, offhandedly, as context for something else. The rains had come hard in the second week of September, the kind of sustained mountain rain that saturates the ground and then keeps going, finding the cracks and the channels and the old fracture lines in the limestone substrate that underlay most of this gulch. He found the fracture line 6 inches from the corner of the outhouse pit. A crack in the exposed rock, maybe 2 inches wide at its widest, running downhill in a rough straight line toward the well. He pressed 2 fingers into the crack and felt moisture. In October, but after weeks without rain. The crack was still wet. He sat back on his heels and closed his eyes for a moment. The arithmetic was simple and terrible. A new privy dug in August. Pit sunk 4 feet into fractured limestone. September rains, heavy, sustained. Surface water and pit runoff driven down into the fracture. The fracture running downhill 40 feet to the well casing, which was stone laid without mortar on the lower courses. He knew this because he had spoken to the man who dug it, a Swedish laborer named Lindqvist, who had told him proudly that the stone was so well fitted it needed no mortar, which was true, and also meant that any water traveling laterally through the substrate had an easy path into the well shaft. 23 sick, 6 dead, and every one of them had been drinking from that well for weeks. He went back down the hill at a pace that was close to running. The next hours were mechanical. He went cabin to cabin, knocking, pushing doors open, where no one answered. He told the ones who were conscious, 4 of them, barely, that the well was contaminated, and they were not to touch it again under any circumstances. He boiled water from his own reserve supply, a 50-gallon barrel he kept in the surgery fed by roof runoff, and brought tin cups of it to each of them in turn. He spooned morphine sulfate solution into the ones who were deep in fever delirium. He changed the dressings on a miner named Packard, whose dysentery had progressed to open sores. He worked without stopping because stopping meant thinking about the trembling in his hands and the low cramping that had started in his own abdomen sometime around midnight. That he had felt at first as hunger. He had not eaten since morning. He cooked a pot of cornmeal on the surgery stove, ate half of it, and told himself that was all it was. By 2 a.m, he knew it was not hunger. The fever came on fast, the way it always did in the patients he had watched. Not a gradual warming, but a hard spike, the body's furnace throwing open its doors all at once. He sat on the edge of his cot and pressed both palms flat against the wooden floor, which was cold, and felt the heat coming off his own skin. His temperature, when he managed to hold the thermometer under his tongue long enough to get a reading, was 103.2. He had drunk from the well himself. 3 days ago, before he knew. 1 cup, maybe 2, drawn in the evening when his water barrel had run low. 1 cup was enough. What he knew from his journal entries, the incubation ran 8 to 14 days in most cases, but in several it had moved faster, particularly in patients who were already run down or compromised. He had been sleeping 2 hours a night for a week. His lungs were not strong. His reserves were not what they had been at 30. He got up from the cot. He crossed to his desk, opened the journal, and wrote the date and time at the top of a fresh page. Then he wrote, "Physician infected. Estimated 36 to 48 hours of functional capacity remaining. Well must be sealed before incapacitation. Spring source identified at approximately half-mile uphill, northwest bearing, above contamination line. Priority 1. He underlined priority 1 twice. Then he closed the journal, pulled on his coat, and began calculating how many rocks it would take to seal a well shaft 3 feet in diameter. Outside, the temperature was still dropping. The wolf called again from somewhere in the timber, closer this time, and the sound carried flat and clear across the snow, the way sounds do when the air is very cold and very still, and there is no one left to hear them, but one sick man and 12 people who had not yet decided whether they were going to live or die. He found the quicklime in the assay office, 2 50-pound sacks, paper-wrapped, stacked against the back wall behind a collapsed shelving unit that had come down sometime in the past week when no one was around to hear it fall. The assayer, a meticulous German named Brenner, had used lime in the ore separation process. Brenner had been among the first to go, day 4 of the outbreak, a fast and hard, dead before Voss had fully understood what he was dealing with. The sacks had sat untouched since then, patient and inert, in the cold dark of the abandoned office. Voss dragged them out one at a time, each sack leaving a pale trail in the dust. His hands were shaking badly now. Not the fine tremor of cold, but the deep muscular shaking of fever, the kind that starts in the core and works outward until a man cannot hold a cup steady. He gripped the sack by its tied neck and pulled and did not stop pulling. Outside, he loaded both sacks onto a flat hand sledge he had found behind the livery, the kind used to haul ore samples across the yard, and dragged it through the snow toward the well. The morning was gray and absolute. No wind. The kind of mountain cold that does not announce itself but simply occupies everything, settling into wood and metal and bone with equal indifference. His breath came in short, white bursts. His boots punched through the snow crust with each step, and he had to lift his feet high, which took more effort than it should have, which told him the fever was already pulling at his reserves harder than he wanted to admit. He worked methodically, because methodical was the only way left to him. He rigged a canvas bucket from a coal sack, punched holes in the bottom with his surgical awl, threaded a rope through the reinforced rim. He filled it with quicklime from the first sack, working carefully, keeping his face turned away, because lime in the eyes ends a man faster than fever. He tied the rope to the well windlass, lowered the bucket down the shaft hand over hand. And when it hit the water, he heard the reaction start immediately. A hiss, low and sustained, like a fire catching green wood. Quicklime hitting water generates heat. It generates calcium hydroxide, strongly alkaline, lethal to the bacteria colonizing the shaft. He had used it once before in an army camp outside Fredericksburg to decontaminate a latrine trench. It worked then. It would work now. He sent 3 loads down. Then he began stoning the well shut. The collapsed assay office had given him his material. The building's foundation stones were loose fieldstone, irregular, heavy, the kind of rock that gets pulled from a hillside and stacked without mortar because in 1882 there was no time and plenty of rock. He carried them 2 at a time to the well, coping, arms wrapped underneath, at the weight driving the fever sweat through his shirt in cold sheets. He set the first course of stones across the well opening, fitting them tight, then the second course offset to close the gaps, then a third. He worked the way he had learned to work in the field hospitals, not thinking past the next immediate task, not calculating the distance between where he was and where he needed to be. Just the next stone, just the next placement, just the next lift. Halfway through the 4th course, he vomited in the snow beside the well. He wiped his mouth with his sleeve, picked up the next stone, and kept going. By the time the well was sealed, 7 courses high, the top stones too heavy for a man to move without a pry bar, his vision had developed a quality he recognized from high fever patients, and a slight brightening at the edges of things, a flattening of depth. He sat down in the snow against the well, coping, and breathed. The sealed well looked like a cairn, like something built to mark a grave. He supposed that was appropriate. He had one task left. The spring was a half-mile uphill on a northwest bearing, above the contamination line, above the fractured limestone shelf, fed by snowmelt from the upper ridge. He had found it 2 days prior while mapping the gulch, noted it in his journal as a clean source, intended to act on it sooner. He stood up, picked up a flat shovel he had leaned against the well, coping, and started climbing. The half-mile took him 40 minutes. The spring emerged from a crack in a granite outcropping at the base of a north-facing slope, clear water running at perhaps 2 gallons per minute, it pooling briefly in a natural depression before sheeting off downhill in a thin rill that vanished into the snow. Voss dug the collection basin with the flat shovel, working the shovel with both hands and his body weight because his arms no longer had the strength to drive it alone. He cut a basin 18 inches deep, 2 feet across, in the gravel and decomposed granite at the base of the outcropping. He lined it with flat stones pulled from the slope above, fitting them as tightly as he could manage, chinked with smaller stones, and packed gravel to keep sediment out. He shaped an overflow channel on the downhill side so the basin would not flood. The water that pooled in it was clear. No green-brown stain, no organic matter, cold enough to ache in the hand. He filled his canteen, drank half of it standing there, and started back down. He made it to the main street of Silver Creek. He did not make it further. He went down in the snow between the Mercantile and the boarding house, not dramatically. There was no dramatic fall, no last staggered step, no outstretched hand. His legs simply stopped working, and he sat down, and then lay on his side, and the snow was very cold against his face, and he was aware of this distantly, the way a man is aware of things that are happening to someone else. His last coherent thought was about the journal, whether he had written the spring location clearly enough. Northwest bearing, half-mile, granite outcropping. He was fairly certain he had written it. He hoped he had written it. He did not remember closing his eyes. He woke in a cabin. The stove was going. The smell of wood smoke and something boiling. Water. Just water. Nothing in it. And he was on a rope-strung cot, under 2 wool blankets and a buffalo robe that smelled of tallow and animal. His fever had broken sometime in the night. He could tell by the soaked bedding under him and the deep, hollow exhaustion that is different from sick exhaustion. Lighter, emptier, pointing towards something instead of away from it. A woman was sitting in a chair beside the stove. She was perhaps 30, dark-haired, with the particular economy of movement that comes from a life where wasted motion costs something. Her name was Clara Beds. She ran the boarding house. She had been one of the 12 too sick to leave with Trevithick's group, bedridden with fever for 4 days, left behind without ceremony in the room she had rented to herself at the back of her own building. She looked up when he moved. She had found him in the street. Down, she said. She had been watching from her window when he went down. It had taken her 20 minutes to drag him inside because she was not strong yet either, and she had stopped twice to rest. She had found his journal on the surgery desk. She had read the entry about the spring. She had sent the miner Packard, weak but ambulatory, up the hill with every bucket and canteen in the building. They had been boiling water from the spring for 2 days. Of the 12 who had been left behind, 9 were alive. The other 3 had died while Voss was unconscious, 2 in the first night, 1 on the second morning. He had known them, a child of 7, a man of 60, and a young miner from County Cork, who had come to Colorado looking for something better than a peat bog, and found something worse. Voss lay still for a while after Clara told him this, looking at the ceiling boards. He did not say anything. There was nothing useful to say. He asked for his journal. She handed it to him. He opened it to the next blank page, wrote the date, November 9th, 1885, and began recording. Names of the dead, names of the living. Water source secured. Well sealed with quicklime and fieldstone. Contamination pathway identified. Fractured limestone. Uphill privy. Compromised well casing. Estimated first exposure. Late September. Outbreak duration. 17 days. Mortality among exposed population. 41%. He wrote for an hour without stopping. Then he wrote a final section at the bottom of the page, the words deliberate and evenly spaced. Yet the handwriting of a man who has decided that what he is writing matters and wants it to be readable by whoever comes after. He addressed it to the Colorado Board of Health. He described the contamination mechanism in precise technical language. He described the diagnostic method, the symptom mapping, the timeline, the elimination of other vectors, the muslin test. He described the spring. He recommended that every new well sunk in any mining camp in the Colorado high country be sited a minimum of 100 feet downhill from any privy, and that all well casings be mortared to a depth of at least 10 feet to prevent lateral contamination through fractured substrate. He had 46 more pages to write before spring thaw opened the freight road, and a man could carry the report down to Silverton and put it on a southbound train. He started the next page. Outside, the snow came down steady and soft over the sealed well, over the empty street, over the 9 people still breathing in Silver Creek. The spring ran clean on the hillside above town, cutting its small channel through the frozen gravel, indifferent to everything that had happened below it. The wolf was gone. The sky was the color of old iron. A fire burned in every occupied cabin window, and the smoke rose straight up in the still air because there was no wind left to push it sideways. And in that stillness, Silver Creek looked, briefly, like a town that intended to survive. It was not sentiment. It was 9 people and a doctor with a journal and a sealed well and a clean water source a half-mile up a hill. That was all. That was enough.